I'm Ian Williams, the trustee for the Griffin Poetry Prize. I'm speaking with Homero Aridjis and George McWhirter, Mexican author and Canadian translator of Self-Portrait in the Zone of Silence. It's published by New Directions, and it's a finalist for the 2024 Griffin Poetry Prize. Hello, Homero and George. Hola.
Hello.
Hola.
Hello.
So this question is for both of you. Maybe let's
Yes.
start with Homero. In a few
Yes.
sentences, how would you describe your collection?
Well, it's an anthology of poems of different periods that more or less have the subject. That is the solar poems and journal of dreams, because it's like I was at the time like dreaming with the eyes open. That is to say, watching the sun. There were more or less the unity was because the perception of the light of the sun, but especially during the day or in the night, everywhere. Yes.
Such a poetic description here. George, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as Homero's vast range and kaleidoscope collected in a volume from various books. But Homero is many poets in one. And he writes about many Mexicos, and Mexico's past, Mexico's present, all its places, its people, its politics, and its gods, and its dogs.
Very good. Very good. Can you tell me about the range? Like, what's the earliest poem and what's the time span in this collection?
To me,
Homero?
yes, it's many years, it's especially poems written in the 20th century, because I am between 2 centuries, but especially the last 25 years. Yes.
25 years or so. And George, how did this partnership come about here?
Oh,
Who approached whom, or can you tell us a bit like how this came to be?
well, I was working on an anthology of Mexican poets, 5 women, 5 men, for Anvil Press here in Vancouver. And for my part of the anthology, the poets I was translating, Homero was one of them. And I arranged to meet Homero, and Homero very kindly brought me to his house, and I met Betty, his wife, and he liked what I was doing with the poems that were going into the anthology, and he and Betty, I think, conferred and decided to ask me, would I like to be Homero's translator? And that was in the previous century, not this. The anthology came out in 2000. It was called Where Words Like Monarchs Fly, and that's an indirect tribute to Homero.
Wow, we're talking
the monarchs.
At least 25 years of collaboration then, at least.
And also through the monarch butterflies, because George, as coming from Canada, and myself coming from the village where the butterflies, monarch butterflies, come from Canada every year, we felt very, very close and united by the flight of the butterflies. It was very magic collaborations, because always I have the presence of George coming from Canada and myself coming from the village where the monarch butterflies arrived to Mexico to spend the winter.
You can send messages to each other on Butterfly, you know?
Exactly. It's what,
Butterfly wings.
yes, I feel very close to George because he comes from the place where the butterflies come to Mexico. Then I assume that George was like a butterfly coming from Canada to translate the poems.
That's lovely.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what like agreement or what kind of understanding a poet and a translator, you both in particular, come to. For instance, George, are you always looking to Homero for like permission? Is this okay? Is this okay? And Homero, are you looking to George? Is this accurate? Is this accurate? What kind of understanding do you have between each other?
Do you want me to answer that first, or?
Yeah, please.
The understanding is it'll go in a little triangle between Homero, Betty, and back to me. So, and that's basically how we work.
And Homero, what are you looking for? Like when you're reading these English, what makes the translation good for you? When are you satisfied?
Because I feel the presence of George, because as I met George and he was translating the poems into English, I felt him as a natural translator of the poems.
Hmm. And so, Homero, on your end, what makes a good translation? When are you satisfied? When has George like done the thing that makes you pleased?
Well, there are two very, very important factors to make a good translation. To get the meaning of the poem first,
Right.
and or to feel it, and second, to more or less be loyal to the poem, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes the words don't disagree with the poem, the words you choose. But the important thing is to get the meaning of the poem and to get the words correct.
Right. Right. Okay, this is something that's much harder to translate. So I'm reading the collection and it seems to belong to a different world, right? I'm
Yes.
reading it in English, but
Yes.
it's more sensory. Everything feels heightened and just more vibrant, right? Everything just feels a little bit more dialed up, more turned up. And I think
Yes.
this is a particularly like Spanish quality. Something about it feels just a bit more saturated.
Yes.
But how do you go about translating a culture's energy or optimism or aliveness into another language? Did you brush up against
Well,
this?
this is the talent of the translator, and also his sincerity, because when the translator is very attached to the poem, more or less he can get the meaning of the poem, and also to get the real meaning of the words.
Can I say something that
Yeah.
you say that Homero's poems are larger than life and they're more colorful. And one of the things, it's not just meaning, and it's what's happening, because a lot happens in Homero's poems. And you have to get the way it happens through the lines right, or it won't work. And the meaning is part of what goes on. And there are some of his poems are really like movies, metaphoric movies that incidents, and there is a whole scenario. For example, he has one poem, El Caracol, which I misread the meaning of. When I was talking about meaning, it means a snail shell. But then I find out Homero said, no, it's not a snail. It's not, all this is not happening inside a little snail shell. This is the observatory at Chichen Itza. And this priest inside this observatory is basically moving from one civilization to another, and
Mm.
moving through all the different places in the observatory. So it's
Yeah.
not just meaning, it's action.
Yeah, and
Translating
there's a
Homero's
kind of like
action. Yeah.
there's a kind of like ease and effortlessness about these kind of impossible situations that you create, Homero. And we just kind of like take them at face value.
Well,
Um,
yes, I feel like the authenticity of the translation with George, because I know him since long time, and there is a compenetration of the poet and the translator through the contacts through almost many years, and for me it's very natural that George translate his poems because I feel the presence of George, not only
Right.
now but always.
and yeah, the trust, right, over the years
Exactly,
of
the
working
trust.
together.
Yes,
So George, you described this as there are many Homeros, right? There's not just one
Exactly.
kind of poet,
yes,
there are many. And in fact, in the collection, there's such a big range too of like
yes,
subjects. You write about politics and corruption and violence, and yet
yes,
the book does not sag into despair. It doesn't
yes.
end up being a bleak collection, somewhat magically, right? That's really special. So there's something like unquenchable or unextinguishable about the voice here. Like no matter how heavy the subject matter is, there's a kind of buoyancy or lightness. So how do you go about, Homero, I'll ask you this, how do you go about avoiding despair? I mean, it's such an easy position for a poet to
Yes.
fall into.
Always, the thing is that always I feel enthusiastic when I write poetry. It's like an energy I got from poetry, and I don't feel even writing about sad things or melancholic things. I feel enthusiasm because the poetry gives me an energy of life, a vitality, and I feel it because at my age I have been writing poetry almost since I was 20 years old. I have spent almost 60 years writing
Wow.
poetry in different stages of my life, but always I approach to poetry with enthusiasm, with energy, with vitality.
Mhm. And George, was this something you were very deliberate about trying to capture? Like this is the quality of the voice that I feel. I didn't read the Spanish. I can't read the Spanish, but in the English, I feel this real joy.
I can hear his voice in Spanish because I've spoken to him. But yes, there is a voice in some places. It's very large with authority. In other places, it's funny. He can be very witty. And some of his poems can be very large and epic, and other poems can be small and intimate. And
Right.
like the poems a poem he wrote, for example, for Betty, which is just a beautiful short poem and totally intimate and very different from, say, another woman he writes about, Mama Coatlicue, who's a monster,
Yes.
or another woman like Lupe Velez, who's a table dancer, or the country woman who's yet different again. And there are dimensions of every character that he writes about. There are dimensions for every god almost that he writes about, from the large to the small. And he particularly likes to write about dogs.
Yes. There
Right. There's
was
that
a dog
palindrome
always
poem.
in my life.
We
Since I
both
was a
love
child, there
dogs.
was a dog and a
Love
goat
dogs.
also in my life.
Mm,
Yes,
which is
George is right because there is in my poetry there's always this enthusiasm for life, for
yes.
poetry, for animals, even enthusiasm in the presence of death. Because
Mhm.
Mexicans make a feast of death. It's
Yeah.
a day of the dead. All the Mexicans are dreaming with death, and then it's very contagious to have these feelings about death in Mexico.
Enthusiasm is a
I
good
grew
word.
up in a small village, and
Mm.
every year, November the 2nd, I went with the people of my village to the cemetery, and everybody had his or her dead people in the family, in the past, in the present, and myself, even if I was a mestizo in a way, because my father was a Greek and my mother was a Mexican, I felt the same, the presence of death in many cultures, because it's very strong, this presence in Mexico. And it really is like a way to offer to feel a Mexican, to feel the presence of death.
Right. Yeah. In one of the poems you say, I live in a state of poetry
Yes.
because for me, being and making poetry are the same. And in
Yes.
this like short conversation with you, I can hear it too, right? That you
Yes.
are in a state of poetry. But is this state something that's available to everybody? You
I
know,
don't
is this
know.
available to bankers and to teachers and to, you don't think so? Or
I,
no?
I
Or
I hope that was a leitmotif for everybody, because we have this chance, this opportunity to be alive. And for me, there is not a more happy circumstance for humans than to be alive. I guess even if you are living in a miserable state of anima, but the way the only fact that you are alive is a way to be happy, to feel the happiness of the existence. I guess there is no biggest joy for a human being than to be alive, to the perception of the light, the perception of life, love. Is wonderful.
Mhm. The enthusiasm is contagious here. And
I hope
George,
so.
you're
I hope so.
George,
Yes.
you're the voice of enthusiasm as well, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
um, so I'm gonna ask you to share a poem in Spanish and the English translation for us.
Okay. I have chosen one that is translated by George. Soy first in Spanish and later in English. Yes. Soy un indocumentado de la eternidad. Soy un indocumentado de la eternidad, un ilegal que cruza las fronteras del sueño. El pasaporte de la existencia ha caducado y sin papeles mis huesos valen nada. Viajo de noche hacinado en un camión sin luces y duermo en las trastiendas de la ley. El sueño americano se ha convertido en un infierno del exilio de mí mismo. En las esquinas acecha la migra por sus redes para atraparme como a un extraterrestre. Ha salido de las sombras, me saludan cuando emerjo de las trastiendas del trabajo. No importa, como un mojado celebro el paso del viento en los altares del desierto y contemplo el infinito en el lugar donde estaban las torres gemelas. This was written in New York during a manifestation May 2006. You want to read it in English also?
Yes, please. George, would you like to read it in English or?
Yes.
Okay, I'll
Thank you.
read it in English. I
Yes.
am an undocumented in eternity. I am one of the undocumented in eternity, an illegal crossing over the borders of the dream. My passport for existence has expired, and without papers, my bones are worthless. Piled into a truck with no headlights on, I travel by night, and I sleep in the back rooms of the law. the American dream has turned into a hell of an exile for myself. To trap me like some extraterrestrial, the migra lies in wait around the corner with its nets. When I emerge from the toilets at work, they point at me. He's come out of the shadows. Doesn't matter. As a wetback, I celebrate the wind blowing over the altars of the desert and meditate on the infinite in the place where the Twin Towers once stood.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Homero Aridjis and George McWhirter, author and translator of Self-Portrait in the Zone of Silence. It's published by New Directions, and it's a finalist for the 2024 Griffin Poetry Prize. Thank you both for speaking with us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.